If there is no God,
Okay.
is slavery a bad thing?
Well, I mean, instinctively, I would say, yeah, it's a bad thing. But I think it's because I am appealing to a moral standard.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode of the Identity Crisis podcast. I am your co-host, Jalen Thompson.
Dylan Schweitzer.
Dylan, how you doing today, man?
Doing pretty good. I got the giggles today.
Yeah,
which is great for such an uplifting topic like today.
Yeah, this is so fun and exciting. But we did have the giggles before this, so that was good.
Yeah.
That actually might help us to flow in the episode. Yeah, and it makes it a little lighter too.
Yeah,
because the conversation can get a little heavy.
Yeah. So I mean, let's just jump right in.
Let's do it.
We're gonna tackle a very lighthearted, easy, simple subject today for our viewers. You ready, Jalen? Does the Bible condone slavery? I mean, it has the word slave in it.
You got a point. Oh, this question's been around for a long time. So, this is one of those. This is one of those that you hear at the barbershop.
Yeah.
This is one of those that you'll hear at the family cookout.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear it at you'll hear it just a bunch of random places. You'll hear the Bible. Plus, who want to follow the Bible? It condones slavery, or it's misogynistic. It's all of these different things. Condones racism. All of these different things, right? So when we look at that, when we look at that question, first we have to ask, where does this claim even come from?
Right.
And is it true? For first and foremost, and oftentimes where it comes from is from the Old Testament, from some of the passages in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And then you'll have some people refer to the New Testament as well, because it gets talked about there as well. Some of the New Testament verses that you may hear things like Ephesians 6 and 5, where it says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your earthly masters, with respect for authority and with a sincere heart, seeking to please them as service to Christ.
Jeez, that sounds on the surface. It sounds a little suspicious.
It does.
Or sus, as we might say today.
Exactly. And then you got Colossians chapter 3, verse 22, bondservants, slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord.
Yikes. So it does condone slavery.
When you rip it out of context, it can.
Right.
But oftentimes what we do with the Bible is that's exactly what we do, is we rip things out of context. And there are passages within the Bible that when you rip them out of context, you can get them to say things that you want them to say, or that you think that they're saying, until you actually spend some time studying the context around the verse, studying who the verse was talking to, what's the literary style of the passage, what's the object of the passage. And then when you do that, you start to look at this whole thing a little differently. So we're going to...
Yeah, and even zooming out more, not only in the context of the chapter, but within the book that it's in, within the side of the Bible that it's in, and within the Bible itself. I mean, we have to kind of constantly zoom in and zoom out to get a full scope of what this is talking about.
Absolutely.
And so easy just to kind of take half a verse and be like, see, it means this, because I think so.
So before we get into does the Bible condone slavery, let's pause here for a second, because if there is no God, is slavery a bad thing?
Well, I mean, instinctively, I would say, yeah, it's a bad thing. But I think it's because I am appealing to a moral standard. It's really easy because we have this sort of moral code written on our heart, and it's really easy to kind of appeal to this intuitiveness to us.
Sure.
And with theism, specifically Christianity, we have a clear foundation from from moral standpoints and why things are right or wrong. But on atheism, specifically naturalism, just because it's a more specific thing that we could point to, there's not really a right or wrong action.
Right.
There's not really a purpose to life. Mm-hmm. And so to tell someone how to live their life, if we were to equate it to a game, for example, right? If we're playing football, if I throw an interception, I know that's a bad move because my goal is to score touchdowns. If there's no purpose to this life, if I was to kill someone or enslave someone, you can't really say they did a bad move because there's not really rules or an objective to move towards. I think that's the big thing. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think you have an uphill battle that you're fighting if you say there is no God, but yet slavery is evil, because you're suggesting that human beings have intrinsic worth or intrinsic value, and that slavery demeans them in a way that has them living beneath that value that they have. But then the question becomes, where does that intrinsic value come from in atheism or naturalism? And so I find it very difficult to have this conversation if there is no God, because ultimately it's not whether or not slavery is bad. If there is no God,
I like it.
It's whether or not I like it or I dislike it, and then it becomes, okay, bad for who?
Right. Because I mean, it's great for the plantation owners when you think about it. Cheap to free labor.
It's great for the economy. You know, I mean, what's the biggest expense in any business's
workers?
Payroll.
Yeah.
Right. So you get free labor to produce your product, to manufacture your product. Come on, man, this is great.
Yeah.
And in naturalism, it's just a taste. It's a personal preference, right?
Right. And I think it's interesting because logically we can lay that out, but emotionally and instinctively, whether or not you acknowledge God or not, we know that's wrong. We know that's the wrong answer, but we have no justification on why that's the wrong answer on a naturalistic framework.
Absolutely.
I think that's what I find fascinating about the moral argument in general and trying to find a foundation for moral values outside of theism, because there's not really anything you could lay it down. Like, oh, well, it could be a propitiation of society, and society flourishes when humans do good. So, okay, but who gets to choose who flourishes? Who gets to choose what flourishing looks like?
I was going to say, what is flourishing? Who defines that?
Right.
Right. Yeah. So that has to be laid out first. That in order for this slavery that we're getting ready to discuss to be objectively bad, the way that we know it is, theism is a much better grounds for that position than atheism. So now let's kind of get into
is theism actually against it?
Exactly.
Right. Or does it approve?
Exactly. And so when in conversations that I've heard, listened to, been a part of, it is often said that Christianity was introduced to the Africans, and let's talk about slavery here in America.
Sure.
It's often said that Christianity was introduced to African slaves by their European slave owners.
Yeah, that's what I was told growing up.
Absolutely. And from history, however, says something different. History actually says that's false. History actually notates, and the Bible actually notates this as well, that Christianity has been in Africa since the first century, Northern Africa in particular, since the first century.
And Christ came in the first century.
Exactly.
So that's right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning, and it reached Africa within a few decades after Christ had left and ascended. And so
think about that from ancient historical times. That's like an ancient news flash compared to like when you think of like an autobiography by like Alexander the Great, from its predecessor, the person who died, Alexander, and it being written about was 500 years later. Yet we consider that a reliable document. But Northern Africans got the gospel within a couple of decades. And that is extremely quick by ancient historical standards. That's totally different than it just being handed down. Or would that be like 1800 years later?
Something like that.
It's like a night and day numerical comparison.
Absolutely. And actually the Coptic Church of Egypt, they actually attribute a lot of their early development to the work of the Apostle Thomas, who was the doubter, right?
Oh, Doubting Thomas.
Yeah, they attribute a lot of their early church development to him and John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, John Mark's actually considered to be the guy who really drove the spreading of the gospel in Africa, in Northern Africa in particular, in the beginning. And so this idea that we got the Christianity, black people wouldn't even be Christians, or Africans wouldn't even be Christians if it were for it being introduced by these white Europeans. It's a totally false notion. We actually see this also in the book of Acts. Where we find Philip witnessing to the treasurer of Ethiopia.
Oh, it's right there in the Bible.
Right there in the Bible. So Christianity and that treasurer ends up taking his gospel back to Ethiopia and doing what? Spreading it.
It's in the Bible, man. It's right there.
And so once again, this idea, history doesn't line up with this idea, not at all. And then also in terms of African history. History also tells us that the number of believers in Africa actually grew rapidly under persecution, which is strange, right? Oddly enough, right? That the number of believers in Africa actually grew under persecution. So, and this was thousands of years before slavery here in America. This is what I'm talking about, okay?
Right.
I'm not talking about when the African slaves came here to America. I'm talking about before there was any Western slave trade. There were thousands of Christians in Africa.
Right.
So I just want to
make it abundantly clear
that this idea that the white people came and gave Africans to Christianity, false.
Right. They
had it already.
And for a long time.
Before we got to the Western slave trade. So now when we're talking about the slavery as it relates to the Bible, I think there are three questions that we need to ask to understand slavery in the Bible, because there are texts in the Bible about slavery.
Right.
But so we need to first understand is, what does the scripture mean by the word slave? Now I think the second question we need to ask is, how did a person become a slave? And then the third question we need to ask is, how were these slaves treated? Or what did the scriptures say about the treatment of these slaves? And I think when you do a compare and contrast between those two, you very quickly see that the slavery done here in America and the slavery in the Bible are not even close.
And so one of the most common things you see in the Old Testament specifically is that slavery, and I feel weird almost calling it that, because growing up, when we hear the word slavery, we just immediately, instinctively associate that to American slavery here in America.
Absolutely.
But the word slavery used in the Old Testament oftentimes was used for someone who was signing up for a voluntary debt release program, i.e. they chose to go into this. So an easy way to kind of lay it out for someone was in great debt to someone. That person had a farm that person could work on. It's like, hey, I'll sign you up to come work on my farm. You could work off your debt. And the thing was, the Bible has specific rules and protocols that the slave master, we could call them, has to put upon the slave. So like after 6 years, no matter how much debt was accumulated in the past, and let's say we'll use today's numbers, for example, they owed $1 million, they've only paid off like 100,000. If after 6 years they haven't paid it off, it was wiped clean and they were free to go. That doesn't sound anything like American slavery.
Exactly. And so great point. And so that term slave, in the Bible, that term in the Hebrew is actually it's abad.
Abad.
Yeah, and it means to serve, bond service, husbandman, compelled laborer, worshiper.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it's a very unique twist that the Bible takes.
And I find compelled laborer an interesting term, because you might call that to someone today who is passionate about their job, a compelled laborer. You know what I mean? Especially if you're signing up for this debt release program.
Absolutely.
I don't know about you, but I got some debt, and I'm picking up extra hours. I feel compelled to work to pay that debt off. And you know what? I I don't have any debt release program, man. I got to pay this whole thing off, and interest is accumulating.
Right.
So,
Right. And in 6 years or 7 years, you ain't getting released.
it's going to be bigger too with interest.
Oh man. And so that's the Old Testament term for the word slave. And then the New Testament term is doulos. And this is the definition is someone who belongs to another, a bond slave, without any ownership rights of their own. And it's actually a commonly used term for those who were followers of Christ in the New Testament.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So when you peel back the onion and you start to get back to the original writings and the original meanings of these words, you start to see that it takes on a whole different meaning.
That's really interesting because when I think about, I can't remember where exactly the scripture is in the New Testament, but it talks about how we were bought with a price and we are a part of the body of Christ. And when we look at the New Testament term doulos, it's saying we have no ownership rights of our own. I feel like it's more attributing to that spiritual concept, not really a physical, literal concept.
Exactly.
I find that really fascinating.
Exactly. And then the question becomes, the next question that we have to answer is, how did a person become a slave in the Bible? Yeah, 4 ways primarily.
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on signing up for the debt release program,
which was that'd be like a debt repayment. You had contractual agreements, which would be a part of that debt release.
Yeah.
You had restitution for crime.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can basically work your way off of a sentence.
Yeah.
For a crime that you committed. And you also had prisoners of war.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another way that a person became a slave in the Bible. And then,
and I guess to highlight that, typically the prisoners of war were people who, if you did not do that, they were absolutely going to attack Jerusalem or the people that like that. So they were doing it for almost safety precaution reasons.
Absolutely.
If you think about it, it's more of a humane way instead of just killing them all.
Exactly. And so now let's get into the juicy part of this whole thing, and that's how were the slaves treated. Right.
That's the one where people start ripping it up.
Exactly. So you touched on one thing with the whole 6-year term.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that point right there is huge, because obviously when you look at the slavery that took place here in America, there were no terms. Okay. There were no 70-year liberation. There was none of that, right? So that's obviously a big difference, because the fact that you can only be a slave for 6 years, and then on the 7th year you were let free.
Right.
Another point I want to bring up is how female slaves were actually treated like wives.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they were treated like wives, and dare I say, better than male slaves.
Oh.
Well, and here's why I say that. Check this out. In the scriptures, according to the Bible, female slaves cannot be resold to foreign people. You can do that to a female slave. If she didn't please her master, she actually got to walk free. And then if he decided, that the master decided that he was going to designate her for his son, that she was to be treated like a daughter.
Interesting.
So basically, she's a part of the family now.
That's like adoption.
Pretty much, right? If the master who purchased her were to take another wife for himself, her food, her clothing, and her marital rights were still intact.
Interesting.
So he still had to make provision for her, take care of her. She was still a part of the family. Another huge difference between the American slavery and what happened here in the scripture, which we'll call it indentured servitude in the scripture, because that's the proper name for it, is that the slaves were able to inherit and purchase property for themselves.
Oh, that is not allowed in America.
Come on.
That
Come
never
on, guys.
happened.
Come on,
That
guys.
almost never happened.
Come on, guys. We're not comparing the same thing.
Yeah.
Another point: their lives were protected by the law. You couldn't just kill a slave.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that. And these were foreign slaves actually had refuge under the law as well, so they weren't treated as property either. Now we know what happened here in America as it related to slaves.
Yeah.
You had one time that you found not doing what you were supposed to do.
It's really interesting because at this point we haven't even gotten into like the big stuff with this stuff yet, and I already find it extremely baffling how different they are. And oftentimes when you hear people make these objections that the Bible condones slavery, they almost have never read the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they read the Bible, they didn't look very hard into it.
They ripped something out of context and said, this is what it says, this is what it means, that's the end of that.
Or if we give them the extra benefit of the doubt, they read it at a surface level and they didn't dig any deeper.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes when you find people who maybe get a little excited in the beginning, like, oh, I'm going to read the Bible. We'll get through Genesis, and it's like, man, that was 50 chapters. Exodus, let's go.
Right.
And then you start getting into the temple and how it's supposed to be built and the architecture. Then you get to Leviticus and all the laws.
Mm-hmm.
And usually they're winded. And by then they're tired. They're like, man, what's this stuff with slavery? Slavery's wrong. There's no God. And usually people don't make it past Leviticus if they try to read the Bible from the Old Testament through.
Right.
Even some Christians, honestly.
Absolutely.
So I think this is a great example of that. You either find people who tried to read the Bible and didn't do it, or oftentimes people are just rehashing talking points they've heard from other people.
Absolutely. Another thing that made it different: kidnapping was forbidden.
Okay.
Couldn't do that in indentured servitude in Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Injury was forbidden. Couldn't just beat slaves,
right,
because you felt like it. Runaway slaves were given refuge in Scripture.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you weren't, if a slave ran away and got away, they weren't reported back to their master.
Mm-hmm.
They were given refuge. Is that apples and oranges, man?
Apples and airplanes.
I like that one better. Apples and oranges.
This is not even similar.
It's not. Another thing that happened in biblical indentured servitude versus American slavery: a family member could purchase your freedom by simply paying off your debt.
And then they just walk home or just leave?
Leave.
That is...
You're free.
Yeah, that's not how it works.
Does that sound like American slavery to you?
No. Not even a little.
Exactly. Now let's discuss American slavery a little bit.
Yeah, let's dive into the history of our great country.
Yeah, well, our you know.
The not so glamorous part.
The not so glamorous part. So, slavery will probably be referred to as America's original sin, right?
That's an interesting way of framing it.
That's where a lot of people hang their hat with America, and then you kind of get into some of the racial issues, racial tensions of the South, Jim Crow South, and things like that. But slavery is where things get really touchy here in America.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about this notion that Christianity was given to us by our white slave masters.
Sure.
And as a descendant of a slave myself, this is actually something that I take very seriously.
Absolutely.
And so I actually got a copy, but I shouldn't say a copy, it's more of a manuscript copy of a slave Bible.
A slave Bible?
Yep.
You can show it that way.
Should I show it this way or whichever way we need to show it?
Yeah, act like you're on The Price is Right, where you're like...
Right. Yes, I got a copy of a slave Bible here. And these were the Bibles that were given to the slaves for them to read by their white slave masters.
So it's probably the exact same thing, unedited, exact scriptures and everything, right?
Until you do some digging.
Okay.
So come to find out, these Bibles contain about 11.5% of the Old Testament canon that we have today.
So like almost 90% was just
redacted.
Just taken out?
Redacted. 10.4% of the New Testament canon that we have today
was
redacted. No, not 10% redacted. It was about 90% of the New Testament was redacted as well.
Really?
Yes. So in this slave Bible, you're dealing with about a fifth total of the canon that we use today for scripture.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, it makes sense.
Maybe they were trying to make a condensed reading plan.
I wouldn't call it that. I think they were trying to create submissive slaves
and push a narrative.
That by being submissive and subservient to my slave master, I am pleasing God.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, they had to redact almost 80% of the biblical canon that we use today.
That's nuts. It's really interesting because if the Bible explicitly condones slavery, why do we have to take away like 3/4 of it?
Well, and that's where we get to the intellectually honest portion of this discussion. If I have to do this to a document to communicate a message, the document does not communicate the message I want it to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we're being honest, does the Bible condone slavery? If I have to remove 80% of the content to communicate that it condones slavery?
Clearly, no. I mean, there's obviously at least one or two things in that 80% that what they felt was going to go against the narrative they were trying to push.
I mean, they removed 34 total books of the Bible were removed.
Out of the 66.
Out of the 66, 34 of them were completely removed altogether. And now where this slave Bible came from was plantation owners in the West Indies. So this was actually before American slavery. So this slave Bible was created before American slavery was even around. Yeah. So this was actually for the British West India Islands.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But the same Bible was given to the American slaves. But plantation owners in the West Indies, they feared that the slaves would rebel if they heard certain Bible verses, because 3 years prior, or not 3 years, a few years prior, I shouldn't say three, I know that for sure, but a few years prior, some Haitian slaves actually led the first successful slave rebellion. Oh, wow. And they formed a nation out of it. And so
I did not know that.
Exactly. And so that's what that rebellion concerned the plantation owners as it related to spreading the gospel worldwide. And they had issues with missionaries because they're like, hey, I don't want these guys to hear certain things, because if they hear them, it's going to incite a rebellion, and there goes my way of living.
Wow.
And so to compensate for that, there was a society created called the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. And they came together and approved of a redacted, bastardized version of Scripture that gives the slave a glimpse of God, little glimpse of God, but keeps them as a submissive slave. So you get a little bit of God, so long as you capitulate to what I want.
Right. And I think the most interesting thing is when people do rip verses out of context, they almost exclusively grab from Leviticus. They're like, see, the Bible does condone slavery. But the interesting thing is, I was looking at this earlier today, they took out all of Leviticus.
All of Leviticus.
Now, if that's the go-to place to grab verses to prove the Bible condones slavery, and if it's so obvious, why did the people who made the slave Bible take it out completely? I mean, that right there should say something.
Says a whole lot.
Yeah, I mean, we even have a list of percentages, which I think is really fast.
Yeah. I mean, we'll just go through the first 5 books of the Bible because that's where we find a lot of slavery stuff that we don't like. So in Genesis, they had 28% of the book of Genesis, so 14 chapters of Genesis. We have 50. Exodus has 40 chapters total. The slave Bible had 2 chapters. Leviticus has 27 chapters. The slave Bible had 0. Numbers had 36 chapters. Slave Bible has 0. Deuteronomy has 34 chapters. Slave Bible has 8.
It's nuts. And so, especially when you look at the Pentateuch, right?
Pentateuch.
The foundation of what the Bible sits on, the mantle, if you will. If it's so clear that the Bible condones slavery, why take out, let's see, that would be 28:5. That's not even an eighth. You had to take like 6, 7 eighths out of the first chunk of the Bible. That how is that intellectually honest to say that?
It's not intellectually honest. And so I think where we where we have gotten lost, particularly for Black people in particular, is we've gotten lost in the emotions of it and the anger that we feel, which is actually the anger that we feel about it is a testament to the value that we have as human beings and how slavery is a violation of that dignity and that value that we have that God gave us. We get lost in that, however. And when we get lost in that, we lose sight of the fact that, hey, guys, they didn't just hand them a Bible and say, here, read this and go ahead and be on your merry way and be a good slave.
Yeah.
No, they gave them a totally manipulated version of the Bible that we use today.
Right.
And when you look at it that way, you have to be honest with yourself and say, wait a second. No, the Bible doesn't condone slavery. They twisted the scriptures to get it to say what they want.
Yeah.
And if we're being honest, we've all done that.
We have all done that, honestly.
Now, I may not have done it with slavery.
Right, or something this extreme.
But I've seen people do it with sex.
Oh, that's the big thing right now.
Absolutely. I've seen people do it with the idea of hell. I've seen people do it with judging. I've seen people do it with tithing.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So though I may not have done something as grotesque as manipulated so that I can enslave people, I manipulated it to get what I wanted.
And that's at the core of the problem that stemmed from this anyways. They wanted something, they twisted something to get it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really interesting because if you go to the very first book of the Bible, which I thought it was interesting that they kept in the creation account and the garden account in Genesis, one of the first things that the snake does in the garden is he doesn't necessarily lie to them where he completely eradicates what God says, but he twists and morphs the truth. Like, God didn't say exactly that. He said you'd become like him. Oh, you're going to be jealous, essentially. And so he takes what God said and twists it to make them want something different or to look at reality differently. And, I mean, this is just a book of serpents at the end of the day. It's the same thing.
Absolutely. And I think you hit something on the head there that we've been dealing with since the fall. And that's what Satan's his first 4 words that we see in scripture. Did God really say?
Did he really say that? That man be tripping. Did he really? Are you sure? God really say that?
Exactly.
We can have some slaves.
Exactly.
Oh, we pushed it. We pushed it.
Wow. But that's where that's where we've been hung up for a long time now. We've been hung up there for a very long time. Is that did God really say?
Yeah.
And so to answer the question, did God really condone slavery? No, he did not.
Debunked.
Absolutely debunked.
And I think this is one of those arguments where I want to see it just go away. Like, it's so annoying to hear because I see it so often online. Well, the God of the Bible is a condone slavery, therefore it's not true. And it's just so clear. It's clear as day that that's just not true. And I think if the only piece of evidence that I could lay on the table is just those statistics about the books that were actually left in the slave Bible, that was the only piece of evidence that I had, you would still have a clear case. You're just pointing to why do they have to take everything out?
Why?
To make it look like slavery was okay.
If it's so clear, you don't have to waste your time doing this.
And that would be a quick cut, done.
Absolutely. So you have anything else on this subject matter, man? I think we hit this one pretty good.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I think that hits everything. That
being said, make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you like and follow us on Facebook. We're excited, man. Thank you for watching. Thank you for having us. Until next time, God bless.